Thank you, Livy. As we begin exploring special education needs this year, let's start by considering the overall needs we see in schools. As we start the 21-22 school year, we're likely to see that many more students than before may be behind. It's more important than ever to use universal screening to identify grade and school level needs in schools and to act on tier one needs first. So let's very briefly explore what we know. I expect that these data won't surprise anyone on this webinar. And so we'll jump into that. So what we see from data over time, we at Illuminate Education, like other assessment companies, we've been summarizing the differences we're finding in learning throughout the pandemic. So the data I'm going to show you are from FastBridge screening measures in particular, and they represent information we learned toward the beginning of the pandemic. The study looked at K-8 learning using our computer adaptive screening measures, A-reading and A-math. In the area of reading, we saw that learning was impacted. And what you see in this graph, the blue line shows the overall gains for cohorts of students from fall to fall. So it represents data from 3 separate years of school. So the variation or standard deviation of the mean of the gain across the 3 years is represented in the black bar. And then the gray line represents the growth from fall of 2019 to the fall of 2020 for cohorts of students. So you can compare the 3 years prior to fall of 2019 to fall of 2020. So capturing learning growth from pre-pandemic to the very beginning of the pandemic. You can see here, there's a difference in the growth seen from fall to fall across all grade levels. All grade levels did see, there's differences between grade levels, but all grade levels did see a significantly lower gain from fall to fall in 1920 than in the 3 previous years. So we can explore those same data for math, and you'll see the same thing. You'll see a significantly lower gain from fall to fall in 1920 compared to the 3 prior years, with differences at different grade levels. So what does this really mean, though, in terms of the size of the missed opportunities in learning and helping students get more additional opportunities to learn? So this table shows reading and math gaps for each grade level. And what you'll see here is the average score difference on the adaptive measure, the overall effect size, and then the column that's shaded shows you the size of that loss in terms of months of growth. So what we see is at lower grade levels, you'll see relatively less loss of growth with 1 to 2 months worth of loss. And then at higher grade levels, it can be up to 4 months worth of less growth. The implication here is that students will need to make twice as much growth for either from anywhere between 1 to 4 months to close that difference in growth from previous years. And this applies as we think about special education considerations, specifically because as we're often making decisions about student eligibility for services, we're comparing their scores to norms collected prior to the pandemic. And so remember that these differences play a role then in what we see overall, play a role into those comparisons. And these data in particular are specifically from the beginning of the pandemic and don't necessarily represent any additional loss of growth opportunities that students received in last school year. So to summarize this research, we noted that annual growth is significantly less during COVID years compared to the previous 3 years. Math was definitely impacted more than reading. We saw math growth differences that were larger in grades 3 and above. Those growth differences ranged quite a bit from less than 1 month to 4 months. And we're also, one other final thing to note is that these data represent only one study and didn't capture the results from a long period of time. So the data from the last school year still continues to be examined. But what we know is that we do need to take these considerations into context as we're making decisions and around special education this year. So Wendy, I'm also interested, I know you have done work with learning more about the pandemic's impact on learning in the districts that you serve, and I'm interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, we conducted a similar analysis looking at historical growth data and then compared it to the 2021 screening data for each benchmarking period. So we looked at fall to fall, and then we looked at winter to winter, and then we looked at fall to spring to determine the impact of the pandemic over the course of the 2021 school year. So I'm going to briefly show you a few examples of how we analyzed and organized our data. We compiled this data as a SCRED region, which included 8 elementary schools collapsed into one data set, as well as separately for each building, because each school has slightly different demographics and resources. So we really wanted this data to be as meaningful as possible at the local level. We used our FastBridge screening data, which included A reading, A math, early reading, early math, CBMR, and math automaticity. So in this first chart, there is a lot of data to look at, but we have grades running down the first column and then school years running across the next 4 columns. And then that last column indicates the pandemic impact reported out in terms of monthly learning loss. So then within each cell, we have multiple pieces of data. So the first set of data across the top of each cell is the percentage of students who were proficient in the spring across the years for each grade. Now, we didn't collect screening data in the spring of 2020 due to school closures, so that's why you see the NA there. So if we start at the second grade cell and move horizontally, these would be second grade students from 17-18 school year through the 2021 school year. And then if we start at the second grade cell again and move diagonally, we can see the same group of students as they move through the grades as indicated by the yellow colored cells. So in this case, you can see second graders as they move to third grade, as they move to fourth grade, and then as they move to fifth grade. You can see those proficiency levels and then the mean scores. The second set of data, which is the mean scores, that's in the middle of the cell. So that is the mean average screening score for that grade. And then in the last column to the right is the impact of the pandemic reported in months of learning loss. So that's indicating the difference between the pandemic and pre-pandemic growth from fall to spring at the top of the cell. And then in the middle of the cell, that would be the growth from winter to winter. And then at the bottom of the cell, that was growth fall to fall. So what this tells us when we look at the pandemic impact column with regard to growth is that our second graders grew 3 weeks less from fall to spring in the 2021 school year than our second graders did in previous school years. Now, what's really important to note here is that in the winter, the pandemic impact was 2.5 months of learning loss. So the students were able to close that learning gap by almost 2 months from winter to spring. And that's when we were able to bring most of our students back for at least hybrid or some in-person learning. So this is why we included the 3 sets of data in the pandemic impact column, so we could determine if the learning loss had increased or decreased as we moved through that 2021 school year. We also disaggregated the data by learning model. So we considered multiple learning models to be whatever the learning models were as indicated by the school over the course of the year. So that consisted of in-person, hybrid, distance learning. You know, each school was differently impacted. And then we included parent choice distance learning as for those students whose parents chose to keep them in distance learning all year. So those kids never came to school. They were always in distance learning. So in this example, notice how the mean fall score is fairly similar between the students in the multiple learning models. We have a mean score of 488, and then a mean score for the parent choice distance learning of 490. However, notice the spring score for the students in multiple learning models is 502 versus 498 for the students in the parent choice distance learning. So that's indicating 14 points worth of growth for students in the multiple learning models versus an 8-point growth for the students in the distance learning from fall to spring. So as a result, the students in the distance learning had a mean score 2 points higher in the fall, but by spring had a mean score of 4 points less. So that resulted in a 6-point difference between the two groups. So what this tells us is that the students in the multiple learning model dataset started out with a mean score in the fall between the 36th and 37th percentile and ended up in the spring around the 40th percentile. So based on national norms, they had a slight increase in their mean scores. However, the students in parent choice distance learning started out at the 40th percentile nationally in the fall and ended up around the 30th percentile in the spring, indicating approximately a 9 percentile drop nationally. So we can see that there was a difference in that growth between those two learning models by looking at the data that way. We also disaggregated the data by disability and SES status to determine if these populations grew at the same rate. So then in this example, you can see that the students without disabilities and the students with disabilities only differ by about 1 week of learning loss. And then the same is true about students with lower SES. So with that said, even though in this case the growth is fairly similar, we can see that the mean scores are lower for both of these subgroups. So we really want to ensure also that our students with disabilities and lower SES are growing at faster rates if we're going to close that achievement gap and not let that continue to widen as they get older. Another way we disaggregated the data is by growth using the normative categories: aggressive, typical, modest, and flat growth from FastBridge, using the charting feature in EduClimber to determine the type of growth by disaggregated populations. So as you can see in these charts, the special education students actually made more aggressive growth than in the general education students. So that aggressive growth, that would be kind of that teal colored growth, and the light blue, that's typical growth. So as you can see, there's a lot more teal for the students with special education or disabilities than with the gen ed. So this is just another way that teams can look at student growth between screening periods. Now, the data that I just shared with you, these are just examples of how your school can use screening data to look at all students as well as students by subgroups based on disability, ethnicity, SES, and intervention groups. The important takeaway, though, is not to make assumptions about how your student outcomes have been affected by the pandemic, because we found students, buildings, and districts were all impacted differently. Using your own historical and current screening data will help you efficiently determine the impact of learning loss, so that way you can start to prioritize actionable instructional planning at both the core and intervention level. It's also important for building and district teams to dig deeper into grades and/or buildings that had less of a learning loss in order to help identify what they did so we can all learn and grow from each other. Unfortunately, we're not out of the woods yet with regard to the pandemic. So any intentional planning based on data that can be done proactively is critical as we move into this school year. We did learn a lot last year, so let's take any positive nuggets we can glean and move them forward into this year.
As we consider this daunting work ahead of us to close these achievement gaps and meet the needs of students with disabilities, and MTSS is a really great place to start. This pyramid that you see represents all of the resources in our school, both general and special education in nature. The Tier 1 resources should be specifically designed to meet the needs of the vast majority of students in the district. And Tiers 2 and 3 then represent more intensive resources that are provided to students as they need them, including resources from special education resources. So as you move up the pyramid, you'll see students receive more intensive and more individualized supports. When I was first learning about MTSS and first implementing it, we used to talk about the pyramid as containing all the students in the school. So we talk about our red students and our green students. I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had over the years answering questions about if our students with special education services were included in the pyramid or not. What I've learned over time is that it's not the students who are red, yellow, or green. Students who are called red actually still also need the really great things and teachers that are happening in the green tier. Eventually, we started referring to the pyramid as actually representing the resources in our school, including all of those resources. And it may seem like a really small shift in vocabulary, but it has really big implications. The main one for me was that when it's resources as opposed to students, the pyramid is designed to be all of the resources needed to help a student be successful. That means that most of the students who need tier 2 or tier 3 resources can be proficient in academics and social emotional behavior with those resources. It's not that they're a yellow student and therefore, it's okay that they don't meet our expectations. And it's okay that they need those extra supports and we're not seeing the adequate growth. It also shows very clearly that any student may receive resources across the pyramid. As a special education administrator, I would find myself often having to advocate for students to receive tier 1 resources in addition to the more individualized special education resources they need. An MTSS framework supports our work in special education from the beginning of a student's educational journey. And that is because the foundation of an MTSS is prevention. Early intervention and prevention are critical for our friends with disabilities. It's critical to the challenging work we face this year, especially, and ensuring that our child find efforts don't overqualify students who don't have disabilities or act in a biased way against students who didn't have access to education in an equitable way during the pandemic. It includes universal screening. Step 2 described in our graphic for today's session. So this includes step 2 of our graphic for today's presentation also talks about universal screening, which is a critical part of this prevention work that we're talking about. And universal screening is essential to ensuring that we have a system that's focused on prevention and early intervention. I've never worked with a district that's implementing early intervention really well without a universal screening system in place. Screening allows us to improve the foundational resources we provide to all students, as well as helps us to identify students who need access to intervention resources. So after we have universal screening data, we have to review and act on those data. In cases where there are more students who need intervention than we have intervention resources to support, we need to intensify tier 1 instruction. This will improve learning trajectories for all students, including many students with disabilities, assuming they have access to those resources as part of their instructional packages. So today's session isn't focused on tier 1 intensification, but some ways to consider addressing tier 1 needs include things like whole group intervention, intensifying current instructional practices that you have in place, and improving student engagement in learning. And by implementing tier 1 improvements, we're likely to meet the needs of students through using general education resources. And in addition to addressing tier 1 concerns, interventions for groups of students should be implemented as close to screening as possible, beginning within a week of completing universal screening whenever possible. And that's step 4. We think about providing we've universally screened, we've addressed tier 1 concerns, and now we're going to group students for intervention, identify students who might need intervention. And we're doing that typically pretty closely to those universal screening data being collected. And when we talk about intervention, we're really referring to supplemental instruction that occurs for some or all students in a class. In this case, since it's tier 2 intervention or tier 3 intervention, it's students at risk of not meeting reading or math standards. And so this intervention needs to be targeted to specific skill deficits that we find and we know that we need to address for students. When we think about effective intervention, there are several components that make those up. Dr. Joe Torgensen outlined these in a 2006 article. And when we think about the purpose of intervention, including specially designed instruction, we know that we're intending to close achievement gaps. And these characteristics, such as increasing the intensity of instruction and practice and being responsive to student data are really essential to those efforts and seeing the outcomes that we want from the interventions that we're putting into place. When we think about tier 2 interventions, many schools use their universal screening data to identify where to target that supplemental instruction. This is an example of one such report that schools use. This is from using FastBridge screening data. It's the screening intervention report in the FastBridge system. This report uses both broad and skills-based screening tools to recommend targeted intervention and instructional plans. Whichever screening tool you use, it's really important to have some way to quickly target intervention so they can begin immediately after screening. Wendy, I also know that you work with your districts to target interventions to students, and I'm hoping you can share some about how you think about this work.
Absolutely. We also use the screening to intervention report in FastBridge to determine classwide and supplemental interventions, as well as some flow charts with how to include screening and essential standard assessment data. So at the tier 2 level, as Sarah mentioned earlier, we only have supplemental resources to allocate to approximately 15% of the student population. So as a reminder, if 80% of the students are not meeting essential standards and or your universal screening assessments, then you should be looking at class-wide interventions. In addition, our universal screening data, we also ensure that our essential summative assessment data is rigorous enough. So really looking at, here's what our universal screening data is telling us. It should align with what our essential summative assessment data is. So if by winter, 80% of our students are passing the grade level essential standard assessments, we would expect similar results on our screening data. Further, when we look at our spring screening data, we would expect alignment with our summative and state assessment data. So that universal screening data is really kind of like our check on those combative informative assessments that we're giving in the classroom, as well as our state assessment data. If they're not aligning, then we really need to dig deeper to ensure that those summative assessments that are given in the classroom that are typically teacher-made are rigorous enough. So this is an example of a flow chart that can be used to help determine tier 2 interventions using your universal screening and essential standard summative assessment data. By including both the screening and the summative assessment data, teams can better determine what kind of intervention is needed at that grade, class, or intervention level. So this flow chart here is specifically looking at tier 2 supplemental intervention needs. We also have similar flow charts for tier 1 and tier 3 on the SCRED website in our MTSS manual. So before ever collecting any diagnostic data, whenever possible, if teachers can use patterns of student performance on universal screening to form intervention groups, that should be the first step. But I want to take a closer look at how we use screening data to dig deeper into determining supplemental intervention needs when students are missing some of those necessary foundational skills that our screening measures are no longer assessing. So in this example, we have a second grade student who's reading 35 words per minute with 80% accuracy on a CBMR or ORF measure in the fall. So the flows chart is suggesting to assess decoding to determine the appropriately matched phonics intervention. Phonemic awareness should also be assessed if phonics skills are below grade level standards, spelling is a concern, and or family history of reading difficulties. For this student, because his fluency and accuracy are far below benchmark, we need to gather some additional data to determine intervention need. However, if a student was just a slow but really accurate reader, then we could feel more confident to say that only a fluency intervention was needed and we wouldn't need to do further assessing. Typically at the elementary level, the length of the intervention is flexible depending on how long it takes the student to master the skills. They generally participate in interventions for 20 to 30 minutes, 4 to 5 times per week, and then progress is collected weekly and analyzed every month. At the middle and high school level, students may often be scheduled into like a supplemental reading class that meets daily for 1 semester or trimester, And then progress is analyzed every month. And at the end of that term, it's determined whether or not the student has a continuing need for this type of intervention class. Again, for further information on these additional flowcharts, you can visit the SCRED MTSS manual on our website.
Once students have received targeted high quality interventions for enough time for the instructional package to show growth and to have valid progress monitoring data, teams can review and respond to those data. During this time, teams review group and student progress, identify continued needs, and intensify instruction as needed. Many times in special education, we're very used to considering individual student needs, and we forget to build team practices that consider the impact of the overall instructional packages on students' progress. We'll spend some time digging into how you can consider the progress of a group of students to help ensure that as we make high-stakes decisions about individual students, we're considering all important variables. I'll turn it over to Wendy to explore ways to engage in this work.
So we use a database decision-making flowchart that includes self-check questions for teams to use when reviewing the effectiveness of an intervention. So let's take a closer look at why and how teams can use these questions to guide those decisions. So after the intervention plan is developed, the next step is to implement the plan and determine if the intervention is being implemented with fidelity. This is often an overlooked step, with implementation integrity is often a common cause for a student's lack of response to an intervention. As noted by Vanderheiden and Tilley, the most common reason for lack of response to an evidence-based intervention that's well matched to a student and skill area is the failure to implement the intervention as designed. One common issue is low intervention attendance. For example, an intervention designed for 30 minutes per day may actually only occur 20 minutes 3 to 4 days out of a week due to scheduling difficulties, student absence, or not all the time scheduled actually being utilized for instruction. So I've seen where the intervention is scheduled first thing in the morning, but the student arrives 10 minutes late to school most days. So it's really imperative that the interventionist is documenting that the student's missing that first part of the intervention. I was also recently consulted on a case where the team was looking at changing the intervention because of lack of student progress across the entire intervention group. However, when we dug deeper, the interventionist was being pulled to sub at least a couple days per week, which resulted in the intervention only being implemented about half of the intended time. So it wasn't an issue with the intervention, but it was an issue that needed to be addressed by administration to find another solution to the sub shortage. Poor intervention integrity is another common issue. For example, an intervention may inadvertently omit a step in an intervention that affects student performance. I've seen this commonly happen when the last step of the intervention is to have students practice reading the phonics skill that they just learned in connected text. But because they run out of time, the reading the connected text portion of the intervention always gets skipped. So if a team has defined a specific intervention to be delivered, and the intervention was actually delivered, it differed from the agreed upon plan, then the success or lack thereof can't be attributed to the original plan. If this happens, then additional instructional sessions that follow the correct procedure should be conducted and then the data reviewed again. Intervention effectiveness should be determined by looking at how all the students in the intervention group are responding. Like Sarah said, we don't want to be jumping right to the individual student level when we need to look at the intervention group in itself first. So if the majority of the students in the intervention group are not making adequate progress, then the intervention needs to be reviewed for fidelity, as we noted in the previous slide. However, if the review indicates that the intervention was implemented with integrity, but most of the students are not making adequate progress, then the plan should be reviewed to ensure an appropriate instructional match. This may involve conducting diagnostic assessments. Once fidelity and instructional match are determined appropriate, the team may also want to look at the intensity of the intervention for the group. For example, a phonics intervention may include reading individual words in connected text. However, the intensity may need to be increased by adding a phoneme grapheme mapping component using Elkanon boxes, where the students identify how many sounds are in a word, push a token for each sound into that box, and then write the grapheme for each one of those sounds. Then read the word using continuous blending. All too often, teams think that they need to do something completely different, when in fact, they just need to increase the intensity of the intervention. Now, if the majority of the students in the intervention group are making adequate progress, then the student who shows minimal response to Tier 2 moves to Tier 3, where more intensive and individualized supports are added. So increasing the intensity of an intervention at Tier 3 level can be accomplished in a number of ways, such as lengthening instructional time, increasing the frequency of instructional sessions, reducing the size of the instructional group, or adjusting the level of instruction. For most academic foundational skill monitoring on Tier 2 interventions, curriculum-based measures at grade level are used for frequent progress monitoring due to the unique sensitivity of these measures, which allows growth rates over short periods of time to be identified. However, these data alone are not enough to signify academic growth for students who are significantly below grade level. In addition, the progress measure must match the specific skill area that the intervention targets. So as a result, the academic progress monitoring will likely include both CBM and mastery measurement, especially at this Tier 3 level. So mastery measurement data is supplemental to CBM data. It's also referred to as specific skill mastery measurement or sub-skill mastery measurement. Mastery measurement data can be used to inform the interventionist on how well a student is learning a specific skill, and can be particularly useful when a student is making minimal progress on grade level and instructional level CBMs, despite a well-designed intervention plan implemented with fidelity. However, it's important to note that a timed CBM is the best predictor of overall progress in an academic area. CBM progress monitoring data quantify the effects of the intervention program by depicting the student's rate of improvement over time. Below grade level CBMs may also be used at the student's instructional level as a supplement when grade level probes are too challenging and not sensitive enough to growth. However, if teams decide to use both grade level and instructional level CBMs, they should consider administering the grade level probes less frequently to reduce the number of times the student is exposed to progress monitoring that isn't really meaningful to drive the instructional changes. So now let's take a look at some real student data using this process. So here's an example of a Tier 2 kindergarten intervention group who is working on letter names and letter sounds during the 2021 school year. The intervention group started in hybrid learning model in October of 2020 and was using a combination of intervention materials addressing foundational reading skills. In November, a phase line was dropped indicating the school had moved to distance learning. And then another phase line was dropped once they returned back to hybrid in February. What do you notice about the trend lines for these three students? Do they appear to be making adequate progress in their intervention once they return to hybrid from February to March? They had approximately 6 to 8 weeks of instruction there. What would you do with these students in this intervention group? So student A and student C are both flatlined. What do you think about student B's progress? Is he making adequate progress? The expectation is that kindergarten students will fluently know 41 letter sounds by the end of kindergarten. The last few data points are from March. Based on these last 3 data points, students A and C are averaging 2 to 4 letter sounds, and student B is ranging from 6 to 11 letter sounds. What would you recommend for these students? Well, in this case, the team decided that an intervention change was needed to happen for the entire intervention group since none of the students were making adequate progress. Even though student B is making more progress than student A, he's not making enough progress to close the gap. So the team determined that the students needed more direct, explicit, systematic instruction and phonemic awareness than what was in the original intervention plan. So they increased the intensity of the phonemic awareness component. After 9 weeks of more targeted phonemic awareness instruction, the students had rate of improvements of 3.98, 2.28, and 3.88, with ending scores of 24, 35, and 32 letter sounds correct in a minute, indicating that now the intervention was effective in closing the gap in their foundational literacy skills. Oftentimes, teams are quick to jump to thinking a complete intervention change is needed, individualized instruction is needed, or a comprehensive evaluation for special ed is needed. When in fact, really a tweak to an already existing intervention for the entire group is sufficient. I especially see this towards the end of the year when teachers get nervous about low-performing students moving from one grade to the next. However, it's really important to look at the overall group's performance and then try to intensify the entire group's intervention before making individual changes or decisions. Now let's take a look at another case study. So the problem-solving team received a student of concern from the grade level team. So they began by reviewing the student's historical screening data. As you can see on this chart, starting at the left would be the screening windows, fall, winter, and spring over the course of the years, the grade the student was in. So you can see started out in kindergarten, and then that last row there is third grade. And then we have the grade average, the score, and then the percentile at nation. What do you notice? Is there a difference between the students' pre-pandemic universal screening scores and then the screening scores during the pandemic? No. Over the course of this student's education from mid-kindergarten to the beginning of third grade, her screening scores ranged from the 1st to the 5th percentile. She's definitely looking discrepant from her peers, both locally and nationally. So then the team looked at her historical intervention and progress monitoring data over the course of the years and noted that this student was receiving supplemental intervention since kindergarten. This was her progress monitoring graph in second grade prior to the pandemic. What do you notice? The student had been basically flatlined from October to December in her grade level ORF. Skill-based mastery measurement data, not shown here, indicated she was making some progress, but it was slow. It was taking her several weeks to master beginning first grade level phonics skills. So then the team looked at, well, how did the rest of the students in her intervention group do? How were they responding to the intervention? And they determined that the majority of the students in the group were making adequate progress on both their skill-based mastery measurement and grade level CBMR. So she was not growing at the same rate as her peers receiving the same instruction in that intervention group. So then the team reviewed her current third grade progress monitoring data during the pandemic and throughout the various learning models. So there was some in-person, hybrid, distance learning, all indicated by the phase lines there. Student D was again not making adequate progress. So as a result of her pre-pandemic universal screening and historical data, including progress monitoring and screening data, as well as her current pandemic screening and progress monitoring data, the problem-solving team determined that a comprehensive evaluation for special education was warranted. So there was no need to wait for core and supplemental instruction to be reestablished. So as we moved through those self-check questions using database decision-making flowchart, the case studies, examples were given with ways to intensify instruction as students move through the tiered levels of supports. Additional problem solving, including consideration of changes to setting, format, and delivery of instruction should be considered. So for further guidance, you can refer to the determining instructional changes chart that's in the handouts. When using this chart, ask the following questions, and then you can choose one option to change your intervention. If you're not sure which questions best fit your student, just pick a section, start at the far left, and move to the right. So one thing I often see confusion about when working with school teams is the difference between a Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention. Let's take a closer look at some of those distinguishing features between Tier 2 and Tier 3. So Tier 3 instruction may be defined as instruction provided to a few students who need significant differentiation and greater intensity in their instruction. Interventions at Tier 2 and Tier 3 share many common features. Distinguishing characteristics for Tier 3 instruction include instruction that is more precisely targeted at the appropriate skill, smaller instructional groups, more instructional time, clearer and more detailed explanations, more extensive opportunities for guided practice, and more opportunities for error correction and feedback. It's estimated that 5% of students in any building will need this level of instructional intensity. Tier 3 instruction is provided in addition to core instruction and Tier 2 instruction. So for example, a student will also receive their Tier 2 intervention, which may include 20 to 30 minutes of an intervention targeted to their skill deficit of phonemic awareness and phonics in the morning. But an additional 15 to 20 minutes of more intense instruction is added during the afternoon. For example, this could include additional fluency practice, reading connected text with the decodable readers aligned to the specific phonics skill being taught in the morning. Tier 3 instruction almost always involves a diagnostic assessment to determine the skill deficit and also includes progress monitoring of both CBM and skill-based mastery measurement. Intensifying interventions at Tier 3 level rarely involves moving from one boxed intervention to another, but rather involves those changes to setting and format or changes to delivery, as mentioned in the previous slide. For further information on how to intensify instruction, again, refer to the handout, Determining Instructional Changes chart. Now let's talk about our child find obligations as related to the pandemic impact that we're all facing. It's really created two problems for conducting SLD identification evals, in addition to the difficulty to rule out lack of appropriate instruction. First, what do school psychologists do with evaluations that started before the pandemic? And second, how do we complete new initial evals after in-person instruction resumes? So the first rule out factor in any SLD identification is the lack of appropriate instruction, which seems especially important given the break from face-to-face instruction through the multiple learning models over the course of the past year and a half. Many students were offered hard copy packets, online instructional activities, but most were intended to be more review or apply previous learned material rather than learn anything new based off the St. George et al. 2020 study that was recently conducted. Moreover, there was considerable variability in access to these learning opportunities based on the available technology and internet connectivity. It will be difficult to rule out lack of appropriate instruction as a causal factor in learning difficulties, which makes reestablishing effective core instruction and interventions a top priority. Teams must ensure core instruction and supplemental interventions have been reestablished and implemented with fidelity. A student's test history and rate of improvement should be considered prior and post-pandemic, as in the second case study that we reviewed. It is also important to consider how peers in the intervention group and class are doing as well. If the student looks significantly different than their peers who are receiving similar instruction, then a comprehensive evaluation should be conducted. If not, then the instruction for the class or group should be examined using the self-check questions discussed earlier using the database decision-making flowchart. It is equally as important to make sure that we're not under-identifying students due to the pandemic. For those students who have been receiving Tier 3 supports and displaying a significant lack of progress prior to the pandemic, they do not need to start over in the tiered systems of support or wait until core instruction has been reestablished. Teams are encouraged to use the considerations for multidisciplinary SLD evaluations adapted from NASP, which can be found in the EduClimber Smart Forms in the cloud, or the PDF version is available in the handouts. This will help teams ensure exclusionary factors have been addressed by problem-solving teams.
This year is going to be unlike any other many of us have experienced when it comes to ensuring that our child find responsibilities are accurate and equitable. The 8-step process we've outlined, steeped in the evidence-based principles of an MTSS, is really designed to help in those efforts and is focused on supporting student success. Wendy and I want to leave you with a few key takeaways from our perspectives. You, like us, might be concerned with either over-identification or under-identification of students with disabilities this year. Over-identification may occur if we start to see students who didn't have adequate access to high-quality instruction during the pandemic referred for special education services. And on the other hand, if we cite the pandemic as a reason to avoid referring anyone for special education services, we will potentially deny the due process rights of students who need those services. We also know that strong universal instruction and whole group interventions, while not specially designed instruction in nature, are an essential part of an instructional package for all students, including our friends with disabilities, and can help us avoid some of the over and under identification risks. As you review student data and progress this year, we recommend comparing student progress to those of others who had similar educational experiences over the last year and a half. And lastly, this may be the special educator in me, but there is never a bad time and maybe rarely a better time to focus a staff meeting on special education. Not the paperwork and the due process parts, but the purpose. Discussing what it means when we diagnose a student with a disability, the bigger picture of how our MTSS that supports all students and staff can help with making these high stakes decisions for individual students. Really, thank you for your time during this most busy time of the year. We appreciate all that you do for educators, students, and families. Wendy and I are really happy to take some questions, Libby.
I'll start at the very beginning, Sarah, when you were presenting briefly on the COVID research conducted by Illuminate Education. Do you know if that data was collected from students who were both in-person learning as well as like hybrid or remote?
Yes, it was across students who were both in person and hybrid or remote. It was taken from students who were across the country who were using FastBridge A reading and A math assessments.
And then speaking of assessments, there was a few questions around what the acronym CBM stands for, and I'm wondering if you could both tell us what it stands for as well as like what it is as an assessment itself.
Yeah. CBM stands for curriculum-based measurement. It is a type of formative assessment that originated out of the University of Minnesota in around 1977, mid to late 70s, designed specifically for use with students with disabilities as a way to show frequent and regular progress for those students. It's very interesting, the initial research. Most people don't care about it, but it really is based in fluency and rate of accuracy. And it looks at, it prioritizes indicators of overall achievement in reading and math. And so some of the data that Wendy was showing were specifically related to early reading measures. And in schools, you often see curriculum-based measurement or CBM shown in the way of a reading fluency assessment, where students read a passage, a story for about a minute, and we look at the speed, the rate, and accuracy with which they read. It just happens to be a really strong indicator, actually, and is highly predictive of overall reading skills, including comprehension. There's thousands and thousands of evidence-based articles now showing the predictability of oral reading fluency on later outcomes. Yeah. Wendy, is there anything you'd add to that about curriculum-based measurement?
No, I think you covered it.
Thanks, Sarah. Wendy, this one may be best suited for you. When you're talking about Tier 3 interventions, who is typically the person who administers that? Is it a general education classroom teacher or a special ed teacher or somebody else entirely?
For Tier 3 interventions, typically that is not a special education teacher. It's a general education teacher. So it could be anywhere from, your title intervention teacher, or if we have ADSES in Minnesota, so it could be an ADSES interventionist, but it's typically a general education teacher interventionist.
Excellent, thank you. And this can be for either one of you two, but as a school psychologist, this questioner is wondering, participant is wondering if there is other information that they should be using, other than the norms when indicating achievement and intellectual discrepancies. I can read that again if I butchered it too much for you to understand.
Was the end of your the end of your question dropped off, Livy? Did you say as part of an evaluation or as part of what?
So the question specifically is, as a school psychologist, is there other information we should be utilizing besides norms when indicating achievement and intellectual discrepancies?
Okay. So this is a question I'm guessing about in a comprehensive evaluation that's using an IQ achievement discrepancy model. Wendy, is that how you're interpreting the question as well? Yeah.
Yes.
So I would be, I would look to your local procedures around, and especially those that you're getting during the pandemic to make those decisions about how to report it. I would, however, just strongly as we think about, and it sounds like you are in this session, as you're thinking about looking historically at students, those data in particular this year will just have a little bit of baggage around them, right? Because of the impact of the last year and a half. So I would be also, as you're making those decisions and conducting a comprehensive evaluation, really considering all of the other instruction as well as the performance of peers who've received similar instructional packages and similar educational experiences in the last year and a half as part of that comprehensive evaluation. So obviously that achievement ability discrepancy may be one one consideration that you're making. I wouldn't rely solely on that, or even put potentially as much weight on that as you do as you have in the past as you're making some of these decisions and considering all of the other information that you have available to you. Wendy, would you add anything to that response?
No, I completely agree with everything you said. And then again, a good place to look for additional resources is NASP, so National Association of School Psychology. So I would just look there too for further guidance if you need it.
Excellent. I think that's all we have time for today with your questions. Thank you everyone for submitting them, for being engaged in the presentation with us today. If you do want to learn more about FastBridge, that is the tool that Wendy referenced a few times, feel free to reach out. We are happy to give you a demo. And then lastly, we did just want to let you know that all of our products through Illuminate Education do qualify under the CARES and CRRSA Acts because they do equip educators to accelerate growth for each and every student. So if that is a helpful tidbit, please know that as well. And as a reminder, all the recordings and materials will be made available to you at the end. You can visit the unique landing page for this presentation to learn more about special education services and how you can best help students this upcoming school year. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope you have a wonderful day.